Picture this scene frozen in time, a fortress bristling with enemy soldiers, their weapons trained on the approaches, their commanders confident in their impregnable position. Below, in the bowels of that stone citadel, dozens of American soldiers languish in darkness, prisoners who had jumped from the skies on the 6th of June, only to find themselves captives in a medieval dungeon. The calendar shows late June 1944, and the situation appears hopeless. The fortress garrison numbers 350 battle-hardened troops, well-armed, well-supplied, and determined to hold their ground until the last bullet is spent. Against this overwhelming force stands a small band of exhausted Americans, barely 15 souls who have fought their way through hell itself to reach this moment. Their leader is not some grizzled infantry colonel or decorated Marine officer. No, he wears the uniform of the United States Coast Guard, an organization more accustomed to chasing bootleggers and rescuing sailors than storming Hitler's European fortifications. Yet here he stands, Commander Quentin R. Walsh, about to attempt something so audacious, so utterly insane, that military historians would spend decades trying to understand how it possibly succeeded. The story properly begins 3 weeks earlier, when the greatest amphibious invasion in human history crashed against the beaches of Normandy. The world held its breath as thousands of young men poured from landing craft onto shores defended by concrete, steel, and German determination. Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, Gold, Juno, and Sword became household names, synonyms for courage and sacrifice. The Allies secured their foothold, but securing a foothold and sustaining an invasion are two entirely different propositions. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his staff understood that without a steady flow of supplies, the armies that had landed with such fanfare would wither and die. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every ration of food had to cross the English Channel, and the makeshift harbour facilities constructed on the invasion beaches simply could not handle the volume required. The Allied commanders needed a real port, a deep-water facility capable of receiving the massive cargo vessels that would keep the war machine running. Geography and circumstance pointed to one location: Cherbourg. Situated at the northern tip of the Cotentin Peninsula, Cherbourg possessed everything the Allies desperately needed. Its harbour could accommodate large ships, its docks could handle heavy cargo, and its location made it the obvious choice for sustaining operations in northwestern France. Adolf Hitler and his generals recognized this strategic reality just as clearly as Eisenhower did. Orders emanated from Berlin with typical Nazi fanaticism. Cherbourg must be held at all costs, and if it cannot be held, it must be destroyed so thoroughly that the enemy gains nothing from its capture. The Führer's directive was unambiguous, leaving no room for retreat or surrender. German engineers set to work transforming the port city into a fortress that would make the Allies pay dearly for every metre of ground. Concrete bunkers sprouted along the waterfront, their gun slits covering every approach. Artillery batteries dug into the surrounding hills, their barrels trained on the harbour and the roads leading into the city. The harbour itself became a minefield, with explosives planted on docks, cranes, and warehouses. Mines floated in the water, ready to tear open the hulls of any vessel attempting to enter. Scuttled ships blocked channels, and demolition charges were wired to every piece of infrastructure that might prove useful to an invading force. When elements of the United States 7th Corps began their northward push toward Cherbourg, they encountered a nightmare of defensive positions. The 79th Infantry Division bore the brunt of the initial fighting, their soldiers discovering that the hedgerows and small villages of Normandy had been transformed into killing zones. German machine gunners waited in concealed positions, their weapons positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Mortars rained down from positions the Americans could not see, their shells bursting among advancing infantry with devastating effect. Snipers turned every corner into a potential death trap, forcing soldiers to move with agonizing slowness, checking every window and doorway before advancing. The division's casualties mounted steadily as they ground forward, measuring progress in yards rather than miles. Each street had to be cleared, building by building, each structure potentially harbouring enemy troops ready to fight to the death. The urban combat was exhausting, terrifying, and seemingly endless. While generals and colonels planned conventional assaults, requisitioning more artillery and calling for air support, one officer approached the problem from an entirely different angle. Quentin R. Walsh had spent his career in the United States Coast Guard, an organization whose peacetime mission involved maritime law enforcement, search and rescue, and maintaining navigational aids. He had chased rum runners through fog-shrouded waters during Prohibition, developing a knack for outthinking adversaries who knew they were outgunned. His service record showed a man who preferred cleverness to brute force, who understood that psychology could be as potent a weapon as explosives. When war came, the Coast Guard found itself tasked with responsibilities far beyond its traditional role, and Walsh found himself reassigned to England, where planners were grappling with the monumental logistical challenges of invading occupied Europe. His expertise in ports and harbours made him invaluable, and when the question arose of how to secure Cherbourg before the Germans could render it useless, Walsh's name came up. The standard approach would have been to wait until army units had completely cleared the city, then send in engineers to begin the slow process of assessment and repair. Walsh rejected this methodology entirely, arguing that every day of delay gave the Germans more time to implement their demolition plans. His proposal was radical: form a specialized team capable of fighting its way into the port facilities and securing them before enemy engineers could complete their sabotage. This team would need to be compact enough to move quickly, skilled enough to fight when necessary, and knowledgeable enough to immediately begin the work of salvaging what remained. Walsh envisioned a unit of construction specialists who could handle weapons as well as tools, sailors who could read blueprints as easily as they could read a battlefield. The concept was approved, and Walsh found himself commanding a unit designated as Port Repair Party 4, consisting of 53 men drawn from Navy construction battalions, the legendary CBs. These were not elite commandos selected for their combat prowess. They were welders, carpenters, electricians, divers, and heavy equipment operators. Many had been construction workers in civilian life, men who built bridges and dams rather than storming enemy positions. They received combat training, of course, learning to handle rifles, grenades, and the other tools of infantry warfare, but their primary expertise lay in building and repairing rather than destroying. Walsh moulded them into something unique, a hybrid unit that blurred the lines between combat troops and engineers. He drilled them relentlessly, knowing that when the moment came, they would need to function as soldiers first and construction workers second. The men responded to his leadership, sensing that this quiet officer from Rhode Island possessed the kind of steady competence that keeps soldiers alive in desperate circumstances. The original plan called for Walsh's unit to land on D-Day itself, moving inland immediately to stay close behind the advancing infantry. Weather and the chaos of the invasion delayed their arrival, and they finally came ashore on Utah Beach 3 days after the initial landings. The scene that greeted them was apocalyptic. Wrecked landing craft littered the shoreline, some still burning, others already half buried in sand. Bodies lay covered with shelter halves, awaiting burial details that would come when time permitted. The smell of death mingled with cordite and salt spray, a combination that would haunt veterans for the rest of their lives. Supplies lay scattered across the beach in organized chaos, engineers working frantically to clear obstacles and establish routes inland. Walsh gathered his men and moved them off the beach, joining the stream of troops and vehicles heading into the Norman countryside. Their attachment to the 79th Infantry Division placed them squarely in the path of the German defenders, and the march north became a brutal education in combat. The famous Norman hedgerows, those ancient barriers of earth and vegetation that divided every field, turned out to be perfect defensive positions. German troops would establish positions behind a hedgerow, wait for American soldiers to enter the open field, and then open fire with devastating effect. Each hedgerow had to be approached carefully, often requiring flanking maneuvers or the use of explosives to create gaps. Artillery support helped, but the close terrain limited its effectiveness, and air support could not distinguish friend from foe in the patchwork landscape. Walsh's men learned quickly or died, adapting to the brutal reality of combat in close terrain. They discovered that their construction skills proved surprisingly useful in warfare, as understanding how buildings were constructed helped them determine the best ways to breach them or use them for cover. The march to Cherbourg consumed more than 2 weeks of constant movement and intermittent combat. German resistance stiffened as the Americans approached the port city, with enemy units fighting delaying actions before falling back to prepared positions. The sound of artillery became constant, a rolling thunder that never quite ceased. At night, the sky flickered with muzzle flashes and flares, and men tried to snatch a few hours of sleep while remaining ready to fight at a moment's notice. Walsh led from the front, refusing to direct operations from some comfortable headquarters position. He moved with his men, shared their dangers, and made decisions based on what he could see with his own eyes, rather than relying on reports filtered through layers of command. The men noticed, and their respect for their commander deepened into something approaching reverence. By late June, American forces had surrounded Cherbourg, cutting off the garrison from any hope of reinforcement or escape. The Germans had nowhere to go, but surrender did not appear to be an option they were considering. The city itself had been transformed into a fortress, with every street blocked and every building prepared for defense. German naval personnel, normally responsible for operating ships, found themselves fighting as infantry, defending their port against an army. Artillery crews turned their weapons on approaching American columns, firing over open sights at targets they could see directly. The civilian population, those who had not fled before the battle began, cowered in cellars and basements, praying that the fighting would pass them by. The sound of battle echoed through the streets day and night, punctuated by the crash of collapsing buildings and the staccato bark of machine guns. Walsh's unit entered the outskirts of Cherbourg alongside infantry units and immediately found themselves in vicious street fighting. The Germans had blocked roads with rubble and wrecked vehicles, forcing attackers into predictable routes covered by machine gun fire. Buildings had to be cleared methodically, with soldiers kicking in doors and throwing grenades into rooms before entering. The process was slow, exhausting, and terrifyingly dangerous. A German soldier could hide in a closet or behind furniture, waiting for Americans to pass before opening fire from behind. Windows and upper floors provided perfect positions for snipers who could fire a few shots before disappearing into the building's interior. Every advance came at a cost, paid in blood and lives. Walsh personally led assaults on particularly stubborn positions, refusing to ask his men to take risks he would not share. When a German machine gun nest pinned down an American squad, Walsh organized a flanking attack, leading a small team through a demolished building to come at the enemy position from an unexpected angle. He carried a Thompson submachine gun, that iconic weapon of American infantry, and used it with grim efficiency when the moment required. His men saw him toss grenades through windows, saw him kick in doors with his weapon at the ready, saw him do everything he asked them to do. In the crucible of urban combat, Walsh's unit suffered casualties that would have broken a less determined force. Nearly 1 in 4 men fell wounded or killed, but the survivors pressed on, driven by their mission and their commander's example. The arsenal of Cherbourg represented a particularly important target, a sprawling complex of warehouses, workshops, and storage facilities that contained vast quantities of German military supplies. Its capture would deny these resources to the enemy while potentially providing intelligence about German capabilities and intentions. More immediately, the arsenal's position made it a strong point that threatened American positions, and it had to be neutralized before operations could continue. Walsh studied the complex from positions nearby, noting the heavy doors, thick walls, and limited approaches. A conventional assault would require significant force and would likely result in heavy casualties. He decided on a different approach, selecting a hand-picked team of just 16 men for a lightning strike. The assault went in at dawn when defenders would be at their least alert. Walsh led his small team forward through rubble-strewn streets, moving quickly to avoid giving the enemy time to organize a response. They reached the arsenal's outer walls and immediately set to work, using explosive charges to blow open a steel door that would have taken hours to force by conventional means. The explosion shattered the morning quiet, and Walsh's men poured through the opening before the defenders could recover from the shock. Inside, they found a maze of corridors and rooms, each potentially harbouring enemy troops. The fighting became intensely personal, conducted at ranges measured in feet rather than yards. Grenades detonated in enclosed spaces, their blast magnified by walls and ceilings. Thompson submachine guns chattered in staccato bursts, their .45 caliber rounds devastating at close range. The smell of gunpowder became overwhelming, mixed with dust and the copper tang of blood. German sailors and naval infantry fought back with desperation, knowing that surrender had been forbidden by their high command. They established hasty defensive positions in doorways and behind overturned furniture, firing at the Americans, who methodically cleared each space. Walsh's men used tactics learned in weeks of urban combat, tossing grenades around corners before advancing, laying down suppressive fire while teammates moved to flanking positions. The Seabees turned infantry proved that their training had been thorough, executing small unit tactics with a precision that would have impressed professional infantrymen. Casualties mounted on both sides, but Walsh's team maintained their momentum, refusing to allow the defenders time to organize a coordinated resistance. The battle raged through the arsenal's corridors and chambers for hours, each room requiring clearance before the attackers could move forward. German snipers fired from catwalks and upper galleries, forcing the Americans to advance with constant vigilance. Machine gun positions had to be suppressed with rifle fire and grenades before they could be overrun. Yet slowly, inexorably, the defenders' perimeter contracted as Walsh's men seized room after room, building after building. The ferocity of the attack convinced many German defenders that they faced a much larger force, and resistance began to crumble. Small groups began surrendering, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. These initial surrenders sparked a cascade effect, as soldiers who might have fought on decided that continued resistance was pointless. When the shooting finally stopped, Walsh and his 16 men found themselves surrounded by more than 400 German prisoners. The disparity was almost comical. A handful of American sailors and construction workers had captured a force that outnumbered them by more than 20 to 1. The prisoners looked stunned, unable to comprehend how such a small attacking force had broken through their defences. Walsh organised his men to secure the prisoners and begin searching the facility, knowing that intelligence gathered here might prove valuable. It was during this search that one of the German prisoners, a sailor who spoke passable English, approached Walsh with information that changed everything. The sailor explained that American prisoners were being held in a fortress overlooking the harbour, a medieval stone structure called Fort du Roule, that the Germans had been using as a strong point. These were not ordinary prisoners of war who had surrendered in battle, but paratroopers captured on D-Day when they had dropped inland behind enemy lines. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had suffered numerous casualties on that first day, with many men landing in the wrong locations, isolated from their units and vulnerable to German patrols. 52 of these paratroopers had been captured and were now imprisoned in the fortress dungeon, held under conditions that violated every standard of military conduct. The information hit Walsh hard, as any soldier would be affected by news of comrades held captive by the enemy. He questioned the German prisoner carefully, extracting every detail about the fortress, its garrison, and the condition of the American prisoners. The picture that emerged was grim. Fort du Roule was a formidable position, built on high ground with commanding views of the harbour approaches. Its walls were thick stone, dating back centuries, but reinforced with modern concrete and steel. The garrison numbered approximately 350 troops, a mix of naval personnel and fortress infantry, all well armed and prepared to defend their position. They had machine guns, mortars and ample ammunition, plus the psychological advantage of holding a defensive position against attackers who would have to assault uphill against prepared positions. For a conventional infantry battalion with artillery support, taking the fort would be a difficult proposition. For Walsh and his remaining handful of men, exhausted from the Arsenal fight, it should have been impossible. Walsh assessed his resources with the cold calculation of a poker player examining his cards. He had perhaps 15 men still capable of fighting, the survivors of his assault team, plus a few others who had caught up with his position. They were low on ammunition, running on adrenaline and determination. He had no artillery support, no air cover, no tanks or heavy weapons. Against him stood a fortress full of soldiers who had been ordered to fight to the death. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. Any direct assault would result in the annihilation of his force long before they reached the fortress walls. Yet abandoning those American prisoners was not an option Walsh could accept. They were airborne troops, soldiers who had volunteered for one of the most dangerous assignments in the army, and they had been rotting in a dungeon for 3 weeks while the battle for Cherbourg raged around them. An idea began forming in Walsh's mind. An audacious gamble that went against every principle of conventional warfare. If he could not take the fortress by force, perhaps he could take it by deception. The plan relied on understanding human psychology, on recognizing that fear can be as potent a weapon as artillery. Walsh knew that the German garrison must be demoralized, having watched their defensive lines crumble and their comrades surrender in droves. They would be worried about their fate, uncertain about whether to fight or surrender, looking for any excuse to justify laying down their arms. What if Walsh could provide that excuse? What if he could convince them that continued resistance would result not in an honourable defeat, but in massacre at the hands of soldiers who had lost all restraint? He began preparing for what would become one of the most remarkable bluffs in military history. From his pocket, Walsh produced a white silk handkerchief, an item of personal property that would serve as his flag of truce. He selected Lieutenant Frank Lauer from the Navy Reserve to accompany him, knowing that walking into an enemy fortress required at least one witness to whatever transpired. Together they would approach Fort du Roule under a flag of truce and demand the garrison's surrender, not as supplicants, but as conquerors offering terms. The key to the bluff's success would be conviction. Walsh had to believe his own lies so completely that the Germans would have no choice but to believe them as well. On the morning of June 27th, Walsh and Lauer approached the fortress gates with the white handkerchief tied to a stick, the improvised flag of truce waving gently in the breeze. German sentries watched their approach with rifles ready, fingers tense on triggers. The two Americans walked steadily forward, showing no fear, no hesitation. Behind them, out of sight of the fortress defenders, Walsh had positioned his remaining men with instructions to make as much noise as possible to create the illusion of a much larger force preparing for assault. They were to march back and forth, shout orders, fire occasional shots into the air, anything to suggest that hundreds of soldiers were massing for an attack. The fortress gates opened slowly, and Walsh and Lauer were escorted inside under the watchful eyes of German soldiers who clearly had orders to shoot at the first sign of treachery. They were brought to the German commander, an officer whose name has been lost to history but whose dilemma was very real. He commanded a substantial garrison in a strong position, but he also knew that Cherbourg was falling, that German forces throughout the region were collapsing, and that continuing to fight might mean death for all his men. Walsh read this uncertainty in the commander's face and knew his gamble might succeed. What followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a performance worthy of the finest actor playing for the highest stakes imaginable. Walsh spoke with absolute confidence, his voice steady and cold, painting a picture of nightmare for the German commander. He described an army of paratroopers, 800 strong, that had fought its way into Cherbourg and had been transformed by weeks of brutal combat into something barely human. These were not disciplined soldiers anymore, Walsh explained, but blood-crazed killers who had witnessed too much death, suffered too many casualties, and lost all restraint. They were, he claimed, at this very moment moving through the city, and he could barely control them. He spoke of scalping, of atrocities committed against German prisoners, of soldiers who had crossed the line from warfare into savagery. The German commander listened, his face betraying nothing, but Walsh could see the calculation occurring behind his eyes. The story was plausible enough to be terrifying. Paratroopers were known for their fierce fighting spirit, and the brutal combat of the past weeks could certainly have pushed men to extremes. Walsh pressed his advantage, explaining that he personally had come to offer terms of surrender precisely because he wanted to prevent a massacre. If the garrison laid down its arms immediately and released the American prisoners, Walsh promised to personally guarantee their safety and ensure they were treated according to the Geneva Conventions. But if the commander refused, Walsh would have no choice but to step aside and allow those 800 paratroopers to storm the fortress. And once that happened, Walsh explained with chilling calm, he would not be able to control what happened next. Throughout this performance, Walsh never wavered, never showed a flicker of doubt or uncertainty. His face remained impassive, his voice steady, his eyes locked on the German commander with unwavering intensity. He had learned the art of the bluff during years of chasing criminals who often outgunned the Coast Guard cutters pursuing them, and he applied those lessons now with the lives of 52 American prisoners hanging in the balance. Lieutenant Lauer stood beside him, projecting the same confidence, adding credibility to Walsh's story through his silent support. Outside the fortress, Walsh's small band of men continued their elaborate deception. They marched back and forth, their boots deliberately scuffing on stone to amplify the sound. They shouted orders in loud voices, called to non-existent units, waved empty bazookas as if signalling to infantry positions that did not exist. The performance was worthy of a Hollywood production, and it had the desired effect. German soldiers watching from the fortress walls reported seeing significant troop movements, hearing the sounds of a large force preparing for assault. The psychological pressure mounted with each passing minute. The German commander asked for time to consider the terms, and Walsh granted it with the magnanimity of someone who held all the advantages. In truth, every minute of delay increased the risk that the Germans would see through the deception, would send out scouts who would discover the paltry nature of the American force outside their walls. But Walsh betrayed none of this anxiety, maintaining his facade of absolute confidence. He stood calmly, as if he had all the time in the world, as if the outcome was inevitable and the commander was merely delaying the recognition of reality. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the fortress garrison capitulated. 350 German soldiers filed out through the gates, laying down their weapons in orderly piles, their faces showing a mixture of relief and bewilderment. They had surrendered to what they believed was overwhelming force, never realizing that they outnumbered their captors by more than 20 to 1. Walsh maintained his stern expression, accepting the surrender with the bearing of a victorious general rather than a gambler who had just pulled off an impossible bluff. He immediately ordered his men to secure the prisoners and begin searching the fortress for the Americans they had come to rescue. The dungeon was exactly as the informant had described it. A dark, dank chamber deep in the fortress bowels where 52 American paratroopers had been held in conditions that were barely humane. These were men from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, elite soldiers who had jumped into France on the night before D-Day, many of them landing far from their intended drop zones and finding themselves isolated in enemy territory. Some had fought for hours or days before being captured. Others had been taken almost immediately upon landing. They had spent 3 weeks in captivity, unsure whether they would ever see freedom again, listening to the sounds of battle echoing through the city and wondering whether liberation would reach them before their captors decided to eliminate them as a burden. When Walsh's men opened the dungeon doors, the paratroopers emerged blinking in the sunlight, dazed and weak but alive. They could hardly believe their eyes when they saw the small number of men who had effected their rescue, when they learned of the audacious bluff that had freed them without a shot being fired. Word of Walsh's feat spread rapidly through American units in Cherbourg, becoming the stuff of instant legend. A Coast Guard officer with barely a dozen men had talked an entire fortress into surrendering, had rescued 52 prisoners through sheer nerve and psychological warfare. Military historians would later study the incident as an example of how battlefield success does not always correlate with firepower, how understanding human psychology can sometimes achieve what artillery cannot. But for Walsh, there was no time to celebrate or bask in accolades. The fortress had fallen, the prisoners were freed, but his mission was far from complete. Cherbourg might be secured, but it was a ruined shell of a port, utterly incapable of receiving the supply ships that the Allied armies desperately needed. The Germans had done their demolition work with characteristic thoroughness, systematically destroying everything that might prove useful to their enemies. The harbour was a nightmare of sunken ships, demolished cranes, destroyed warehouses, and thousands of mines floating in the water or buried along the docks. Underwater obstacles blocked the channels that ships would need to use. The electrical systems that powered cranes and pumps had been sabotaged. Even the harbour charts had been destroyed or falsified, making navigation treacherous for any vessel attempting to enter. Walsh transitioned immediately from warrior to engineer, assembling his remaining men and beginning the monumental task of assessment. They needed to determine what could be salvaged, what needed to be rebuilt, and what obstacles represented the greatest threats to reopening the port. Time was the enemy now, as critical as any German garrison. Every day that Cherbourg remained closed was another day that Allied armies had to rely on the limited capacity of the invasion beaches, another day that fuel and ammunition had to be rationed carefully. General George S. Patton's Third Army was preparing for a breakout operation that would exploit the bridgehead and race across France, but that operation depended entirely on the logistics tail that only a functioning deep-water port could provide. Walsh established his headquarters in a waterfront building that had partially survived the German demolitions, setting up a command post that would coordinate all the salvage and repair work. He began systematically interrogating German prisoners who had worked in the port, extracting every scrap of knowledge about where mines had been placed, which facilities had been wired with explosives, and what condition the underwater infrastructure might be in. He also sought out French civilians, dock workers, and harbour pilots who had intimate knowledge of Cherbourg's facilities and could provide details the Germans either did not know or would not reveal. Every conversation added another piece to the complex puzzle of how to resurrect a dead port. The mine situation represented perhaps the most immediate danger. The harbour was infested with various types of mines: contact mines that would explode when struck by a ship's hull, magnetic mines that would detonate when they sensed the metal of a vessel passing overhead, and acoustic mines triggered by the sound of ship engines. Conventional minesweeping could handle some of these threats, but it was slow, dangerous work that required specialized vessels and trained crews. Walsh, displaying the same innovative thinking that had characterized his entire Cherbourg operation, came up with an unconventional solution. He commandeered every wooden sailboat he could find in the region, reasoning that these vessels were too light and too quiet to trigger the mines designed to destroy steel warships. These improvised minesweepers would sail predetermined courses through the harbour, marking safe channels that larger vessels could follow. It was dangerous work, with every trip risking the possibility that a mine would detonate anyway. But French volunteers came forward to crew the boats, eager to help liberate their port. Walsh personally accompanied many of these sweeps, standing on the deck of a small sailing vessel and watching the water for any sign of danger. His presence encouraged the French sailors and set an example for his own men. Their commander would not ask them to face risks he would not share. Slowly, painfully, safe channels began to appear in the harbour, marked with buoys that would guide incoming ships away from the most dangerous areas. Simultaneously, Walsh organised teams to tackle the physical obstacles littering the port. Sunken ships had to be either raised or demolished to clear berths where supply vessels could tie up. Wrecked cranes had to be repaired or replaced, a monumental undertaking given the specialised nature of port equipment. Warehouses needed to be made structurally sound and cleared of booby traps. Electrical systems had to be restored to power the pumps that would keep the harbour functioning. Each task seemed overwhelming in isolation, but Walsh broke them down into manageable pieces, assigning teams to specific objectives and demanding regular progress reports. He bypassed military bureaucracy whenever it threatened to slow operations, using his initiative to requisition equipment and personnel from whoever had them, apologizing to the proper authorities after the fact rather than waiting for approval that might take days or weeks. His approach infuriated some staff officers who believed proper military procedure required routing all requests through official channels, but Walsh had learned that wars are not won by following peacetime regulations. He needed equipment immediately, and if that meant appropriating it from army supply dumps without proper paperwork, so be it. He would deal with any consequences later after Cherbourg was operational. This willingness to cut through red tape and take personal responsibility for unorthodox decisions characterized Walsh's entire approach to the salvage operation and contributed significantly to its remarkable success. Within weeks of Cherbourg's capture, against every prediction and contrary to all conventional wisdom, the first Allied supply ships entered the harbour. These initial vessels carried limited cargo, navigating carefully through the still dangerous waters, but their arrival marked a psychological turning point. The port was no longer dead. It was being resurrected through the determination and ingenuity of Walsh and his men. More ships followed in subsequent days, each one carrying more supplies, each one demonstrating that the harbour's capacity was growing. By August, barely 2 months after Walsh had bluffed his way into Fort du Roule, Cherbourg was operating at near pre-war capacity, handling thousands of tons of supplies daily and functioning as the primary logistics hub for Allied operations in northwestern France. The impact on the campaign proved decisive. General Patton's Third Army launched its famous breakout operation, racing across France with a speed that stunned both Allies and Germans. The tanks that rolled across the French countryside burned fuel that came through Cherbourg, fired shells that had been unloaded at Cherbourg's docks, and were maintained with spare parts that arrived on ships Walsh had guided into the harbour. Supreme Commander Eisenhower, in his post-war memoir, specifically credited the early opening of Cherbourg as one of the key factors enabling the rapid liberation of France. Without that port, the armies would have remained constrained by logistics, unable to exploit their tactical victories because they lacked the supplies to sustain deep penetrations into enemy territory. For his actions at Cherbourg, Commander Quentin R. Walsh received the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for valour that can be awarded by the Department of the Navy. The citation accompanying the medal detailed his capture of 2 major strongholds, the surrender of 750 enemy troops, and the rescue of 52 American prisoners of war. It spoke of extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action against enemy forces, of leadership under fire and brilliant tactical thinking. But reading the citation years later, one senses that even this official recognition somehow failed to capture the full audacity of what Walsh had accomplished. How do you adequately describe the nerve required to walk into an enemy fortress and convince its garrison to surrender through pure psychological warfare? How do you quantify the impact of opening a vital port weeks ahead of schedule, potentially saving thousands of Allied lives by enabling a faster end to the war? Walsh himself never spent much time dwelling on his own heroism or seeking recognition for his achievements. After Cherbourg, his war continued without pause. In August of 1944, he assumed command of a much larger unit, more than 400 men, tasked with helping liberate additional ports along the French coast. The port cities of Brittany had also been designated as fortresses by Hitler, and once again German garrisons were determined to hold or destroy these facilities rather than allow them to fall intact into Allied hands. Walsh found himself fighting alongside Canadian forces in the bitter battle for Le Havre, once again under fire, once again demonstrating the same combination of tactical skill and personal courage that had characterized his Cherbourg operation. The pattern repeated, savage fighting to secure the port, followed by the exhausting work of salvage and reconstruction under constant time pressure. The strain of continuous combat operations in the damp, cold climate of northern France took its inevitable toll on Walsh's health. By the end of 1944, after months of living in the field, sleeping in ruins, and pushing himself beyond normal human limits, his body finally rebelled. Illness forced his evacuation back to the United States, where doctors prescribed rest and recovery. He had driven himself too hard for too long, and even his iron will could not indefinitely override physical limitations. In 1946, with the war won and Europe at peace, Walsh retired from active duty with a service record that few could match. He had gone from chasing bootleggers in peacetime to liberating French ports in the greatest war in history, and he had distinguished himself at every step. Post-war life for Walsh was remarkably modest, given his wartime achievements. He did not leverage his fame into a business career or political office, did not write a best-selling memoir or spend years on the lecture circuit recounting his exploits. Instead, he became a high school science teacher, standing in front of classrooms and explaining chemistry and physics to teenagers who probably had no idea of their teacher's past. Later, he worked as a parole officer, helping former criminals reintegrate into society, applying the same understanding of human psychology that had served him so well at Fort du Roule. He lived quietly in Maryland with his family, far from the battlefields where he had made history, content to let his deeds speak for themselves rather than constantly reminding people of what he had done. Yet when the Korean conflict erupted in 1950, bringing war back to a world that thought it had finished with global conflict, the Navy called Walsh back to duty. His expertise in port operations and his demonstrated ability to accomplish seemingly impossible missions made him too valuable to leave in retirement. He returned to uniform and once again contributed to the war effort, though the specifics of his Korean service remain less well documented than his Normandy exploits. After Korea, he finally retired permanently, having served his country through 2 major wars and numerous smaller crises. Quentin R. Walsh lived into the year 2000, passing away at the age of 90, one of the last survivors of that generation that had stormed the beaches of Normandy and liberated Europe from Nazi tyranny. In his final decades, he witnessed the world change in ways that would have seemed like science fiction during World War II. The Cold War came and went, technology transformed daily life, and the generation that had fought alongside him gradually dwindled in number. One wonders what he thought about the modern world, whether he felt that current generations properly appreciated the sacrifices made on their behalf, whether he worried that the lessons learned at such terrible cost were being forgotten. Nearly 2 decades after Walsh's death, his name returned to the ocean he had spent his career serving. In 2019, the United States Navy announced that a new Arleigh Burke-class destroyer would be named USS Quentin Walsh, designated DDG-132. This represented a remarkable honor and a historic first. Never before had a Navy destroyer been named for a Coast Guard officer. The naming recognized not just Walsh's personal heroism, but also the often overlooked contributions of the Coast Guard to American military victories. These servicemen and women, operating under the Department of Homeland Security in peacetime but transferring to Navy command during war, have served in every American conflict since the service's founding, yet they rarely receive the recognition accorded to their Army, Navy, Air Force and Marine Corps counterparts. The ceremony announcing the ship's name took place in Cherbourg itself, with American and French officials standing together on the waterfront that Walsh had fought so hard to secure 75 years earlier. French speakers praised Walsh as one of the most inspiring figures of the entire Normandy campaign, a man whose courage and ingenuity had not only freed their city, but had helped liberate their entire nation. The symbolism was powerful. A warship named for a Coast Guard officer announced in a French port he had saved, serving as a permanent reminder that heroism comes in many forms and from many services. Today, when we consider Walsh's legacy, we are forced to confront uncomfortable questions about how history is remembered and recorded. His story is not taught in most schools, does not appear in most documentaries about World War II, and is unknown to the vast majority of Americans. The reasons for this obscurity are complex, involving the Coast Guard's lower profile compared to other services, the tendency to focus on large-scale battles rather than individual acts of brilliance, and perhaps the simple fact that Walsh himself never sought the spotlight. But his story deserves to be remembered precisely because it illustrates truths about warfare that are easily forgotten in accounts focused on strategy and firepower. Walsh proved that victory does not always correlate with numbers, that 15 determined men can accomplish what hundreds might fail to achieve if those 15 are led by someone who understands both the technical and psychological dimensions of warfare. He demonstrated that imagination and nerve can substitute for artillery and air support, that sometimes the willingness to take an outrageous risk produces better results than conventional tactics. His bluff at Fort du Roule stands as one of the most remarkable examples of psychological warfare in military history, a reminder that the human mind remains the most important weapon in any arsenal. Beyond the tactical brilliance, Walsh's story illustrates the qualities that define true leadership. He led from the front, never asking his men to take risks he would not share. He made decisions based on the mission's requirements rather than his personal safety or reputation. He improvised solutions when conventional approaches would not work, taking personal responsibility for unorthodox methods rather than hiding behind regulations. He treated his men as the professionals they were, training them thoroughly and then trusting them to execute their assignments with minimal supervision. These leadership principles are timeless, applicable to military operations, business ventures, or any human endeavor requiring coordinated effort toward difficult goals. The physical courage Walsh displayed is obvious enough, walking into enemy fortresses, leading assaults against superior numbers, exposing himself to fire when tactical situations demanded it. But perhaps more impressive was his moral courage, his willingness to make decisions that could have resulted in court-martial if they had failed. Commandeering equipment without authorization, bypassing military bureaucracy, walking into Fort du Roule with a handful of men and a preposterous bluff, any of these actions could have ended his career if they had gone wrong. Walsh accepted those risks because he understood that the mission mattered more than his personal welfare, that getting Cherbourg operational quickly would save lives and shorten the war, and that sometimes achieving important objectives requires disregarding the rules designed for ordinary circumstances. His approach to the salvage operation showed the same qualities that had characterized his combat leadership. He identified the critical path, the sequence of tasks that most urgently needed completion, and allocated resources accordingly rather than trying to do everything simultaneously. He sought expert knowledge wherever he could find it, listening to German prisoners, French civilians, and his own men rather than assuming he had all the answers. He adapted plans as circumstances changed, remaining flexible enough to adjust when reality did not match expectations. And throughout the process, he maintained the same relentless focus on the objective, never allowing setbacks or obstacles to divert him from the ultimate goal of opening the port. When we step back and consider the totality of Walsh's accomplishments at Cherbourg, the scale becomes almost incomprehensible. In the space of a few weeks, with fewer than 60 men, he fought his way through a fortified city, captured 2 major strongholds, freed 52 American prisoners, induced the surrender of more than 700 enemy soldiers, and then resurrected a demolished harbour weeks ahead of schedule. Any one of these achievements would mark a successful military operation. Walsh accomplished all of them in rapid succession, each building on the previous success, each requiring different skills and mindsets. The fortress bluff, in particular, deserves continued study by military professionals, psychologists, and anyone interested in negotiation and persuasion. Walsh created a narrative, the story of blood-crazed paratroopers beyond control, that was just plausible enough to exploit his opponent's existing fears and uncertainties. He delivered that narrative with absolute conviction, never wavering, never showing doubt. He supported the narrative with theatre, the staged movements and sounds that suggested forces which did not exist. And he gave his opponent a face-saving way out, framing surrender not as cowardice, but as a rational decision to avoid massacre. Every element of the bluff was carefully calculated to push the German commander toward the decision Walsh needed, yet it appeared spontaneous, improvised, almost casual. That combination of careful planning and flawless execution under pressure represents a peak of human performance that few ever achieve. In our modern era, when special operations and precision weapons dominate military thinking, Walsh's story reminds us that technology cannot replace human qualities like courage, imagination, and leadership. The most sophisticated weapons systems in the world cannot talk an enemy garrison into surrendering. Only a human being who understands psychology and is willing to take enormous personal risks can accomplish such a feat. Satellite imagery and signals intelligence could not have reopened Cherbourg weeks ahead of schedule. That required Walsh's combination of technical knowledge, willingness to improvise, and refusal to accept conventional timelines. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of Quentin R. Walsh's story, that individual human beings still matter in warfare, that one person with the right combination of skills, courage, and determination can change the course of events far beyond what their official position or available resources would suggest possible. In an age that often reduces war to statistics and technology, to discussions of firepower and logistics, Walsh reminds us that battles are still fought and won by people, and that exceptional people can achieve exceptional results even in the most unpromising circumstances. The destroyer that bears his name will sail the world's oceans for decades, a floating testament to a Coast Guard officer who proved that heroism comes in many forms. When that ship's crew faces difficult situations, one hopes they will remember the man whose name they carry, will ask themselves what Walsh would do when faced with seemingly impossible odds. Would he accept conventional wisdom that something cannot be done? Would he wait for perfect conditions and overwhelming force? Or would he assess his resources, formulate an audacious plan, and execute it with absolute conviction, regardless of the risks? We know the answer to those questions because Walsh already showed us through his actions at Cherbourg. He would take the mission, gather his small band of determined followers, and march straight toward the objective regardless of obstacles. He would improvise, adapt, and overcome, using whatever tools and tactics the situation required. He would lead from the front, sharing every danger with his men, and he would accomplish the impossible through the simple expedient of refusing to accept that it was impossible. That spirit, that refusal to be bound by circumstances or daunted by odds, represents something essential about America at its best. The nation that won World War II did so not through superior numbers or technology alone, though both helped, but through the accumulated efforts of countless individuals who rose to extraordinary challenges and found within themselves reserves of courage and capability they had not known they possessed. Walsh was one of those individuals, a quiet man from Rhode Island who discovered in the crucible of war that he possessed the qualities of a great leader and warrior. His story deserves to be told and retold, taught to each new generation as an example of what human beings can accomplish when they refuse to be limited by fear or convention. The specifics of the story, the fortress, the bluff, the rapid resurrection of a demolished port, are fascinating in themselves, the stuff of great adventure tales. But the deeper meaning transcends the particular events, speaking to universal truths about courage, leadership, and human potential. Commander Quentin R. Walsh walked into a Nazi fortress with 15 men and a white silk handkerchief, faced down 350 armed enemies, and convinced them to surrender without firing a shot. That alone would earn him a place in the annals of military history. But he did far more, accomplishing a series of seemingly impossible tasks through sheer determination and refusing to accept failure as an option. His legacy lives on in the ship that bears his name, in the port he saved, and in the example he set for anyone facing overwhelming odds and wondering whether victory is possible. The answer, as Walsh demonstrated, is yes. Victory is always possible for those with sufficient courage, imagination, and will. The question is never whether something can be done, but whether we have the nerve to attempt it.